think we're good to go.
All right. Glad you guys made it out. I cannot believe you're out here on Monday night with as busy schedules as everyone has. My name is Joe Mulvihill. I am currently teaching at an academy in a little north of here, up in Kennesaw. I've got a master's degree in historical theology and apologetics, and I'm working on a PhD in New Testament studies. It's a distance program over at a place called Red Bood University in the Netherlands, with a director that was suggested to me by a buddy of mine named Michael O'Connor. I don't know if you know Mike at all, but he's a fantastic New Testament scholar. But anyway, I really appreciate you coming out. I think it's an important question. Anytime somebody talks about telling you about their PhD research, you got to keep from nodding off, right? I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, am I gonna? But I think this has some practical import for you, especially given how our society has moved quite quickly towards the idea of the gospel as being a mythological construct of some sort. So that's the area of research I've been doing for the last 3.5 years. I've been looking at specifically alleged pagan parallels to Jesus and seeing if they match up, quite frankly. This is not really a scholarly mission anymore. The New Testament scholars have kind of moved past the myth idea, but society in general keeps coming back to this idea. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the remarkably famous Peter and Joseph movie called Zeitgeist online. Over 100 million views, I think, or something like that. Absolutely astounding. Turned into a standalone DVD, made him an instant celebrity and a very rich person in a matter of about 2 years. The follow-up, Zeitgeist 2, tanked huge online first, and they even released a DVD just to see if that would help, and it didn't really work. But it's interesting that the popular conception of what's going on is it's bypassed the scholarship. The scholarship was wrestling with this question, believe it or not, in late 1700s, early 1800s, even on into the later 1800s, 19th century, into the 20th century. And now it's kind of made a return, but it's not because of any new data. There's nothing new that's going on here with the myth parallel thesis. And that's what I was going to try to do for my doctoral thesis. Interestingly, just to be fully honest with you guys, I just had a setback. I'm in nearly year 4. I got about 407 pages in. If you know anything about doctoral research, you have to literally footnote every couple sentences. So you can imagine a 417-page research paper where you're having to footnote about every 2 or 3 sentences, and it's. And my director said, "Look, it's unmanageably broad." Why that's bad for me is I have to go back and revamp. Why it's good for you is because I was trying to cover a lot of characters. So odds are, if you know of a character that you've heard might be a parallel to Jesus, I've probably done some significant research in that area on that particular character. But that's where I wanted to start. If you look on your handout, this is like homework. This guy sucks. No, you don't have to do any homework or fill anything out. But this is kind of to get clarity on what we're talking about here. When somebody compares the Bible to mythography or myth, you have to ask in what way do they mean mythography, in the sense of specific. For example, this is the first category. Are you really saying that the gospel authors, even if we're up in the air about it, I'm not up in the air about who they are, but in case you were just still kind of wondering about who the gospel authors are you really saying they had a copy of the myth beside them at the editing table? The reason you have to clarify that is because if you were saying that level of borrowing, they're literally lifting a portion of, say, Ovid, out of Ovid and putting it right down in Luke, or they're lifting a piece out of Herodotus and putting it right down in Matthew, or in Mark, or John. If you're saying that, there isn't a scholar alive that believes that. Not a legitimate scholar alive that believes that first stop on our page. Not one. Now, scholars' consensus doesn't mean truth, but it is interesting that no one is saying someone had another book of mythology open at the editing table for the Gospels. That's the first thing you need to know, is no one's saying that, because that is a remarkably difficult thesis to prove. Very, very, very difficult. The next stage is kind of lightening it. It's the archetype, or it's just a category. And this is something you see some scholars taking up, they don't take this up and say, I'm the champion of this idea, but they would say, well, maybe it was in the air. Maybe people were just rising from the dead all over the place, and the gospel writers just took it up, like it's kind of a general mythical story. You know, kind of like the idea of seeing UFOs in the air here. We don't have a lot of hard data, but we see you, that sort of thing. It was kind of in the air. I can't put a specific on it. I wouldn't say there was a specific myth that was open beside the Gospels at the editing table, the Gospel writers at the editing table, but maybe it's just an archetype. Now, the difficulty with this position is, one, scholars don't think there was an archetype of dying and rising gods or heroes. There are situations and stories where there's a dying and rising scenario going on, a return scenario from the underworld, but no one would say it reaches the common level. It's so common in ancient literature that it reaches the level of what we would call archetype, or something that we could call a theme. Do you guys understand the point here? It doesn't really reach that sort of level. And the second reason why this might be taken up by some scholars is because it's really hard to verify this. What do I mean by that? When you think about the parallel idea, you make a parallel between anything. There's so many problems you can run into when you run a parallel argument. For example, Joe Mulvihill's got ears. An elephant's got ears. Joe Mulvihill's an elephant. Now, I've just discounted a number of differences between myself and a pachyderm, haven't I? So the problem is, when you're making a parallel claim, the devil's in the details. So if you move away from, okay, here's a specific example of someone that's copying, to, well, it's not specific, but it's just kind of in the air. Well, now I can't verify whether you're right or wrong. I have no way of checking if your thesis is correct, because I'd have to live in the first century to know what people were kind of generally discussing at the market, or in the Areopagus, or at the lecture halls, things like that. There's no way you protect your theory from being checked. And I guess that's the beauty of it for people that are skeptical of the Gospels. If you can protect your theory from being checked by looking at the details, then it's hard to disprove or prove, for that matter. The last is something, it's general. Some people just shoot the moon and go, okay, look, the entire Bible is a genre of mythography. I'm not going to get into the specifics. I'm not going to talk about the central character in Jesus Christ. I'm not going to talk. The Bible is generally a myth. Now, this has been an esteemed position for most skeptics to just kind of write off the Bible. The reason this is an esteemed thing is because the Bible is very, very unique amongst holy books. Extraordinarily unique. In fact, I'd suggest anytime, check out anything I'm saying. Go check the Bible versus, say, the Quran, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita in Buddhism, even Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon. What you find is a level of historic corroboration that is unlike any holy book on the planet. For example, in the four Vedas, you have, some of them are incantations. They're instructions to get the gods on your side. They're sacrificial rituals. There's no real connection to history. In fact, they openly say, look, these are myths that have a general sort of flavor of truth, but they're not truthful in any sort of specific sense. The Quran doesn't have a lot of historic corroboration. The Bible is really, really unique in that it says this. Look, this is an account of God's covenant people, where they obeyed, where they disobeyed, and where the covenant was fulfilled. And you can corroborate it. Very, very unique. So instead of dealing with that, you just say this. You say, well, there are supernatural elements in it. And we live in the 21st century. So you know what? The Bible's mythology. Now, the reason that particular position is troubling is, one, there's not a lot of scholars that are putting the Bible in the mythography category as a genre of ancient literature. That's the first thing. Second, you have this historical connection. Why is that an issue? Because in the past, you don't have what we call historicalized fiction going on in ancient literature. You guys ever see the movie The Patriot, or a movie where there's a historic situation, Titanic, right? Where there's a significant story that we all know took place, but then there's a fictional sort of narrative within it, embedded in it. You don't have that going on in the ancient world, but one other place, and that's the Iliad, right? Where there was a conflict between these two warring city-states, but we know there wasn't a real Achilles, there wasn't a real Ajax, this sort of thing. So there isn't this genre called historicalized fiction, so you're immediately in a really, really, really tough position if you're going to say the Bible is the genre of mythology. So if you just shoot the moon and say, forget the specifics, when it comes to just the genre of the Bible, it looks like it's mythology. And there are some that argue for that, and there's differences between mythology and just general fiction and folklore. But the vast majority of scholars, even ones that don't share a sort of a traditional Christian approach to the Bible, would say, no, this looks like two things. It looks like an ancient biography, which tends to be extraordinarily historical. And two, if not that, then it looks like there are some commonalities, especially in some New Testament books, between ancient science and law writings, as well as what they would call just straight history. So again, it's not just a history book, it's more than that. But what's interesting is you have a number of scholars saying this is not the genre, it doesn't have the hallmarks of mythography. Give me an example of one such scholar that you guys probably know the name, Clive Staples Lewis, right? Lewis spent his whole life studying myth and legend. And the difference between just generally when people use the difference between legend and myth. Myth is an idea where it's made up wholesale, and these ideas are just made up, right? Legend is where you have a real bare historical figure, say a king, and then you build up all sorts of fantastical tales around them, or a queen, right? So Lewis said, look, I've been looking at legend my entire life, and I've been looking at myth my entire life. You can say a lot of things about the Gospels, you can't say they're that. So when it comes to that genre, I've included a bibliography on your second page, and it's one of the footnotes in my forthcoming dissertation. And the footnote is basically this, or actually on the back page. The bibliography is just in case you wanted to go further and study this a little bit further beyond what I'm telling you tonight. Okay, but I'm going to try to do all the heavy lifting for you. I've done the reading and the research for you, so I'm going to try to give you sort of a synopsis. But if you want to go any further with this research, there's some really, really good resources out there. For example, if you just want to read about, all right, how does the Old Testament and even some parts of the New Testament stack up to mythography? What are the differences? What are the similarities? You could look at a book by John Oswald called, very uncreative title, but the idea is, I think it's called The Bible and Ancient Myth. There's another one by a biblical scholar named John Walton. That's also a really helpful book. But when you get right down to the Jesus thesis, that Jesus was copied from ancient mythology, this is maybe one of the best books. And there's two versions. This is the academic version, woo, right? But they've also got, this is by two scholars, Gregory Boyd and Paul Eddy. Gregory Boyd got his PhD at Princeton. Paul Eddy got his PhD at Marquette, two very well-respected schools, but this really explores the question of historicity, myth, and especially the specific allegations against Jesus. Really, really good scholars, and there's a lay-level version that's much thinner and much easier to digest if you don't really want to go too far with this. The other thing on your handout is a long footnote, and that's because there are some people that shoot the moon and say, look, everything you find in the Bible never took place. Everything. Including Jesus. Jesus wasn't a historic figure that they embellished. He wasn't a historic figure that they adjusted through time and through different editions of the oral tradition that became the written gospel accounts. No, Jesus never existed at all. Jesus was a complete fictional character, never ever existed on the historic landscape. That footnote shows you the number of New Testament scholars, many of which are not in our camp as evangelicals or as traditional Christians with this sort of approach, that say, no, we have better evidence of Jesus than Alexander. We have better evidence of Jesus than Julius Caesar. We have better evidence of Jesus than these other figures. And why is this doubly interesting? Is because Jesus was not a king, a ruler, never built an army, won a war, had a palace. He didn't really do anything overtly political. He was an unknown peasant carpenter from Nazareth. And the fact that we know more about him than some of these other unbelievable figures, we have more corroboration and better corroboration closer to the time period than these other figures. So I wanted you to know when people say Jesus never existed, you should be extremely skeptical that person knows what they're talking about at all. That is alluded to in Peter Joseph's Zeitgeist movie, but it's not even close to being anywhere near scholarly a consensus at all. In fact, most scholars that are in this field would admit Jesus at least existed. Give me an example. There are people that are all about the Gospels being mythography. There's a couple of legitimate scholars. One of these guys' name is Carrier, Richard Carrier, a scholar of classics. That this guy hates Christians, right? He has an internet website called Internet Infidels. The guy's constantly taking swings at, but even he says Jesus existed. Even he says that. There's another guy named Price. Robert Price, yes. Robert Price and his incredible shrinking son of man will at least admit Jesus existed. Okay? So one of the things I wanted you to be familiar with is the idea that this is a strained thesis. Whether you go the particular, with Jesus being a copy of different other mythical figures, or you go the broad, the Bible's just the genre of mythography. Either way, what you're saying is you're moving against the scholarly tide. Now that doesn't mean you're automatically wrong. But what that means is you've got a lot of work to do if this thing's true. You're going to have to upend a lot of people that have spent their lives, professional scholars, what do I mean by professional? People that earn a living by helping others understand subjects they've given their lives to and been vetted, right, in a PhD program or a master's level program. So one of the things you should know, first thing is this, there should be two raised eyebrows when they say Jesus doesn't exist. There is fantastic evidence for Jesus' bare existence, right? Stage two, if they say, well, the Bible overall is the genre of mythography, you can say, well, there's a lot of scholars that don't agree with you, including ones that don't agree with me about some of my ideas theologically. Next stage, well, Jesus was just copied from pagan heroes and things like that. You can say, well, again, the devil's in the details. We're doing a parallel claim. Who are you talking about? Now, if they say archetype, you can say, well, gosh, if it's just in the air, first, how do you know that? You didn't live in the first century. And second, if it's just kind of in the air we breathe, well, I can't verify or deny what you're saying. It's akin to saying, I have dreams about angels. You can know that. I can't verify it. You can't verify it to me. I can't verify it to you. So just remember that the devil's in the details. When I go to, I spoke on this subject at, where was it? It was a church last spring. And some high schoolers there and college age people in the church brought a couple of families of skeptics that believe this about Jesus. Just thought, well, it's clear that Jesus is. They had seen the movie Religulous with Bill Maher, which is remarkably bad thinking. But anyway, either way, they'd seen it with Maher, and they were convinced that Jesus was just another copy of an ancient god or even goddess, right? Just something like that. And when I just pressed them a little and said, well, listen, one of the things I'm doing in my doctoral program is I'm going through these one after the other. Which one are you talking about? And one of the kids said, well, Mithras. And I said, well, Mithras is not at all like Jesus. In fact, there's so many differences between Mithra and Jesus, it dwarfs the similarities. And I said, further, Mithra didn't die. If you're saying this guy looks like someone that died and rose again, you got to die to rise again, right? We don't have a record of Mithras dying. To make matters worse, this was a being that was worshipped well before the first century, but there are no stories about him dying and rising there in Persia, and then was adopted by the Greco-Romans, and then didn't die in that scenario. You have an account of his followers very, very late, hundreds of years after Jesus, saying, well, we have a celebration where we celebrate the presence of Mithras. But if there's no death, who cares if you're celebrating the presence? That could be a spiritual sort of thing. Let me give you another example of just how this is kind of written off. I was disconcerted to see that a lot of college-level textbooks just assume that the Gospels, the Jesus story, the particulars of the Jesus story, say the Last Supper, the first miracle of the wine at Cana, especially the death and resurrection, are prefigured in ancient myths, right? I picked this up from, the guy at Barnes & Noble told me it was a textbook used up north, I'm not sure which schools, but this is an illustrated encyclopedia of world mythology. And it's just, I don't mean to do this, but the very first page to which I turned was this one on Odin and the cosmic tree called Yggdrasil. And listen to this. Not only did Odin hang himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights in order to learn wisdom, but sacrificial hangings from gallow trees were also a favorite Viking way of worshiping a god. An archaeological find that reveals the extent of this ghastly ritual is the Toland man, found at Jutland Peat Bog in 1950. The corpse is so well preserved that it was possible to deduce that he was a prisoner of war who had been sacrificed. The parallel between Odin's voluntary death on the tree Yggdrasil and the crucifixion remains striking. Odin was also pierced with a spear, and like Christ, cried out before he died. Although it's possible that the crucifixion was known in the time that the Odin myth was recorded, there's little doubt that his hanging on the cosmic tree had pre-Christian origins and derived from ancient pagan worship. Odin had long been the god of the spear, the god of the hanged. Odin is not the god of the spear. There's no account of Odin being called the god of the spear. The only account we have is Odin being a god of war. And by the way, a god of trickery in war. A god that he birthed Loki and Thor. You guys, I don't know if you saw the Thor movie. But what we have here is we have a god that has a spear wound of some sort. He doesn't get speared to the tree. He doesn't get hung up on the tree. He doesn't get crucified in any sense. He's hung somehow in the branches. And when he sees the 18 runes of power, he yells and then he drops from the tree. There's not a piercing, there's a spear wound before he reaches the tree. There's no piercing, there's no nailing to the tree. And to make matters even worse, this comes from a poem from the 13th century AD. Why is that a problem? Wow, that's a long, long, long time after. The reason this is disconcerting, guys, is when I started my PhD program, I thought a number of textbooks had just assumed this. And And here's what you need to get in the habit of, if you find something like this in a textbook, here's what, about the half dozen that I looked at the beginning of my research, they never give you original sources. Why? If they give you original source, it's a 13th century poem. We assume it's earlier, but it's a 13th century poem. If they give you that, it ruins the parallel, doesn't it? They also don't give the details. Why is that important? If you give the details, the parallel loses its power, right? Because the devil's in the details. You can only say so long that I'm an elephant. I've got ears, nothing's got ears. Once you get into the details, what I don't have, gray, bad, right? Then you start to see that this is really what they call a spurious or inaccurate parallel. Okay? So I wanted you to be aware. You see this all the time. I was reading a textbook by a guy named Barry Powell. I believe it's in Barry Powell's textbook. That's one that's used at UTK, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, in their mythography studies. And it actually had a list of similarities between Jesus and Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, drunkenness, orgies. That sounds just like Jesus, doesn't it? So, you see this sort of, this is the idea, and there's no original sourcing. There's no scholars that back up what they're saying, and they just sort of include it. They don't even include the story, because if you do that, the parallel's gone. It's gone. Okay? So, another thing to be aware of, and it's on your sheet too, is right down here in the second section, okay? We already talked about the professional scholars' consensus on this subject. The scholars have a resounding no to both. The archetype idea, was there an archetype or a myth category of dying and rising God prior to the first century? Most scholars say no. There are a few here and there that would say, well, we have something like that in really well before the Greco-Romans and the Persian, ancient Near Eastern mythology and some ideas there. You have something like that going on, but it's radically different than what we find in the Gospels. But the general consensus is no one believes there's a dying and rising type. There's a couple of scholars that fight for it, but even, let me give you one. There's a guy named TND, Trigrave Medinger, who wrote, it's high-level stuff, but he wrote an analysis of trying to figure out whether there's a dying and rising type in the ancient world. And he said, I think, and I'm being real tentative here, I think we can say there was one. But here's the problem. I'm not sure, and you could destroy this argument pretty quickly. And here's one thing I am sure of. Whatever that type is that I think I might have proven, prior to it certainly isn't a prefiguring of Jesus Christ. It is radically, radically different than the Jesus story in the Gospels when it comes to dying and rising. That's kind of the research where my research has taken me as well. I would actually disagree about the type. I don't think you see a type. You see some scant examples of beings that return from the underworld, right? But what you don't find are anything like the massive similarity in detail that you have in the Jesus story. Nothing like that. So you don't have specific types of characters that parallel Jesus, and you don't have broad types of just dying and rising typists or archetypes that are prefiguring the Jesus account. Another thing to be aware of, and this is some place where the Zeitgeist movie really, really played on people's ignorance. Okay? Every single figure mentioned in the Zeitgeist movie is a being that was worshipped prior to Jesus coming on the scene. It was pre-first century. So there could be somebody like Mithras, right? Or Mithra. Mithra was the Persian version. Mithras was the Roman version. You have this being that's worshipped and deified in cultures prior to Jesus' arrival on the historic scene. But what you don't have, again, devil's in the details, are the accounts. The accounts that are alleged to be parallels of, say, dying and rising, or healings, or wisdom sayings. Those are all things that come well after the Jesus account. Sometimes hundreds, if not over 1,000 years when it comes to Odin. So I wanted you guys to be aware of, again, the devil's in the details. Original sources are huge. I've known scholars that have offered money for these scholars to give an original source to back up their claims. Just one. Just one. Nobody takes them up. Here's $1,000. Just give me an original source instead of just saying these sort of things. And there are all sorts of pseudo-scholarly works that aren't by professional scholars that I wanted you to be aware are derogated by people that are even sympathetic to the myth thesis. Give you an example. There's a book that was released at the turn of the century called The World's 16 Crucified Saviors by a gentleman named Percy Graves, a non-professional scholar, but he had an interest in Egyptology and the ancient world. I want you to listen to what Richard Carrier, who is sympathetic to the myth thesis, but he knows there are so many there's so much bad scholarship and pseudo scholars out there claiming this sort of thing. He offers this on his website, when it comes to graves. The world's 16 crucified saviors, or Christianity before Christ, is unreliable, but no comprehensive critique exists. Most scholars immediately recognize many of his findings are they're unsupported and dismiss Graves as useless. After all, a scholar who rarely cites a source isn't useful to have as a reference even if he's right. In general, there are 10 kinds of problems that crop up in Graves' work here and there. Graves does not distinguish between his opinions and theories from what his sources and evidence actually state. Graves often omits important sources and evidence and doesn't give the whole story. Graves often mistreats in a biased or anachronistic way the sources he does use. Graves occasionally relies on suspect sources. Graves does little or no source analysis or formal text criticism. Graves' work is totally uninformed by modern social history, even of his time period. Graves' conclusions and theories often far exceed what the evidence justifies, and there's a number of other ones here too. The woman who was one of the principal contributors to the Zeitgeist movie was a woman named, she calls herself online, named Kyria S., or Dolores Murdoch. I wanted you to hear what Bart Ehrman, anybody know who Bart Ehrman is in here? Bart Ehrman, he is the world's best-known New Testament critic, hands down. Teaches at the University of North Carolina. His lectures are the top-selling lectures at North Carolina. They're in the top 50 selling lectures on Amazon for just college lectures there. And the guy is a very fair, a nice guy. I think he's wrong on a lot of things, but he's a very nice guy and a bright New Testament scholar, though he's a skeptic, right? His wife's actually a Roman Catholic. He's an agnostic. Listen to what this guy who does not agree with us at all about the gospel says about Dolores Murdoch, one of the principal contributors to the Zeitgeist movie. Nearly all of her sources are secondary and are themselves wrong on many occasions. An exceedingly high number of her sources are not scholars. She makes quite radical claims without supporting them. Listen to this. This is Robert Price, a Jesus Seminar member, who's even further down the road. He actually believes in some aspects of the myth theory, but he wants nothing to do with these pseudo-academics. Dolores Murdoch is quick to state as bald fact what turns out to be, once one chases down her sources, either wild speculation or complex inference from a chain of complicated data open to many interpretations. One of the most intriguing claims made repeatedly in these books is that among the mythical predecessors of Jesus as a crucified God were the Buddha, the blue-skinned Krishna, and Dionysus. Is there any basis to these claims? This is what Robert Price, uber New Testament skeptic, says. Is there any basis to these claims, which Murdoch drops like a ton of bricks? Again, she does not explain where they come from, much less why no available book on Buddha, Krishna, or Dionysus contains a crucifixion or a resurrection account akin to the Gospels. When Murdoch speaks of the Christ conspiracy, she actually means it. She really believes people got together and cooked up early Christianity like a network sitcom. And who are these conspirators? And this is his words, the Masons. It is remarkable how and where some people's historical skepticism comes crashing to a halt, but it gets much, much weirder than that. We start in the last chapters reading bits and pieces drawn from James Churchward, promoter of the imaginary lost continent of Mu; Charles Berlitz, apologist for the sunken city of Atlantis; Zechariah Sitchin, advocate of flying saucers in the ancient city of Acadia; and of course, all that stuff about the maps of the ancient sea kings. The Christ Conspiracy, and Dolores Murdoch's work, is a random bag of mainly recycled eccentricities, some few of them worth considering for a moment, most dangerously shaky, many outright loony. So I wanted you to see whether, when it comes to some of these pseudo-scholars, the people that are kind of sympathetic to the myth theory, that disagree with us radically on the Jesus theory and on what Jesus means and what the New Testament is, they see these people as people you should avoid at all costs. The Zeitgeist crowd is what they call them. So you have to be really, really careful when somebody sees something online. It's like before internet was around. I know you can't believe it, but before internet was around, we used to say, don't believe everything you see on TV. Well, now it's double jeopardy online, right? So I wanted you to be aware that this is one of the things the second thing, beyond the idea that, look, there may be figures that were worshipped and deified prior to Jesus, but the details come much, much later afterwards, and that's what you have to assess. In my PhD, I'm just assessing, okay, given Mark and given Matthew, is there any pre-Jesus figure, or even contemporary figure of Jesus in the first century, that's considered a myth that looks just like the Jesus account, or even similar in a lot of ways that are crucial ways. And part of that's having a real solid methodology. And that's a way I try to avoid either denying or making a parallel claim, because the devil's in the details, right? So I have a methodology that includes 5 stages, right? One is this myth that's compared to Jesus, is the death and resurrection or return event, is it central to the account? Because in the Gospels we can at least say the death and resurrection is central, right? Second is that, are there competing narratives? Are there a lot of narratives that don't even make sense together? You're just cherry picking things out and leaving all the differences on the ground so nobody sees them? That's the second. There's the competition. The third is, what is the number of similarities? Are there similar sort of scenarios? Are there similar words? Are there striking sort of scenarios that look the same? And if so, what's the number? And then I ask, what's the quality of the connections? Are these connections like, for example, there was a number of, a handful of scholars that said the Egyptian god Osiris, the father of Horus, was a precursor, prefiguring of Jesus. And one of the accounts, they said, well, look, Jesus, got baptized. Well, Osiris gets baptized. When you go to the original source, he gets chopped into pieces and thrown into the Nile River. Now, if you call that a baptism, do you see what I'm saying? That's really, really suspect. You're back to that ear and elephant thing, right? So again, it's hard to chase down all the details here. Oh, last two categories. The other is how strong are the connections between them? What kind of word and event similarity are we talking about? That's sort of along with the quality and number of connections. And then last, but certainly not least, is chronology. Chronology. Does this account predate Jesus? And if it does it fulfill the other categories? And the reason you have a strong methodology is because whenever you make a parallel claim, the devil's in the details. It doesn't mean that the pre-myth has to look exactly like Jesus. This is a figure named Besus, and he had a disciple named Geter, right? We don't have to have that kind of connection, but we really have to have some crucial details that match up. And they have to have a similar meaning scenario. The reason why my criteria isn't just mine, and this is where my director really, really liked this idea. I took the top 4 scholars that aren't Christians on the planet that do this all the time. They try to make connections between, like, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad, right? They take this ancient data and they try to make connection, and these guys are careful because they don't want to look like idiots, right? So they have a real stringent criteria. One scholar is a guy named Walter Burke. He's the professor emeritus at the University of Zurich, Comparative Religions. Another scholar I have is a guy named Jan Poovel, Johns Hopkins University. He also is a guy that makes these connections all the time in the ancient world. Another guy's named M.L. West, and the last is, oh gosh, man, I always forget my fourth. Martin Litchfield West, and Burkert West, Poovel, and oh man, I can't remember the last one. Pinglaze, Charles Pinglaze. These are 4 scholars that are known in our world, in our modern world, from making very, very careful theories, bringing them forward and saying, okay, we think these ancient documents match. But man, it's the exact opposite of what you see going on, the kind of willy-nilly thing in Zeitgeist. Or even in some of the scholars that used to put this theory out as fact. So I use these 4 and use their criteria and combine them to my 5-part criteria, so that when somebody comes to me and says, where are you getting this? You're just doing this because you know that if you use these 5 criteria, no one's going to come out looking like Jesus. I can say, well, these aren't mine. These are people that disagree with my worldview, that are professional scholars that do this all the time, connect ancient data like this. And they put this stuff together, and that's why I'm using this criteria. Because if I don't have a criteria, I'm going to make a false connection. Right? Devil's in the details. So that's the idea. So things to keep in mind. One, be very, very, listen closely. If somebody starts off with Jesus was a myth, you should be immediately suspect. The idea that Jesus never existed is, some scholars call it laughable. Maybe one of the biggest pre-Bart Ehrman New Testament critics, at least as far as the traditional Orthodox interpretation of the New Testament, is a guy named Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann said, you don't even need to entertain for a moment the idea that Jesus never existed. And this guy thought that some bare figure named Jesus existed. We couldn't know anything about him, but then they added all these details to the Jesus account afterwards. Now, that's not the consensus today, but Bultmann made a living saying that sort of thing. So this is a guy that was really, really close to the myth theory. In fact, he said Jesus was a legend, but he said, I would never in a million years say he didn't exist. And this guy was off our reservation in a lot of ways. Same with Bart Ehrman. He just authored a book called Did Jesus Exist? And he said, of course he existed. I don't have to agree with everything, but I'm going to at least say he existed. Stage 2. When somebody says, well, I think that the gospel tends to be mythography, we can say, well, what scholars are you pulling from? Where do you get that idea? Because here's the deal. If it's just the idea of the supernatural being included, you've got a bigger question on your hands, which is, Why is something immediately sent out the back door? Because it has supernatural elements in it. We have a number of historical accounts from people that include supernatural elements, and we assume those are historical. I was at a lunch with a couple of youth pastors a couple of years ago at Ted's. Moment of silence for how good that is. Anyway, Ted's, it was really, really good, and the waiter had heard what we were talking about with the youth pastors. He said, I couldn't help it over here. I know it's probably going to kill my tip, but I go to the college up the road here, KSU, and I find what you guys are talking about really interesting, but I'm not a believer. And I said, well, that's okay. You're just our waiter. You believe, or else you won't wait on us. So I said, when he came back next time, I said, just real quick, what do you think of the Bible? And what do you think about it? He's like, mythology. And I said, okay. So he came back by after he brought our food, and he checked on us a little bit, and I turned to one of my partners, and I said, hey, who were the people that were subjugated under the Romans in the 1st century? And this youth pastor looked at me and went, hey, what are you talking about? I said, no, who were just indulgent? He's like, the Jews, Hebrews. And I said, wasn't the Persians? No. I said, wasn't Canaanites? No. He's like, what do you? I said, so who came to power after Alexander's conquest? Who was it? He's like, you know this. I said, was it Babylon? But no. Well, so the the waiter's standing there. He's like, and I said, I was just wondering, because I didn't know, whatever. Well, he leaves and he comes back, and it's just it's interesting, right? Because he had just said in a polite tone he thought we were crazy for believing the Bible. He said it in a polite tone, right? But he still thought we were nuts. He came back and said, hey, I know what you were doing, and it's not Christian. And I said, well, first, you're not a believer. What are you talking about? What are you saying? And he goes, oh, I just started thinking about it. You were naming historical facts out of the Bible, and if I called it all mythology, I said, right. You have to deal with the historicity of it. And the question becomes then, well, are there certain parts? Then you have to qualify what you're saying. The Bible has some myths in it somewhere. Where? Well, it turns out it's right wherever there's supernatural events. And that's a question not about historicity. It's more of a question about whether you believe God exists and can intervene in history. Do you see what I'm talking about? Because if God can if it's at least possible that God exists, he has the prerogative to reach in. So I said, look, it's one thing to call another holy book mythography, but you really can't. Now I didn't want to get into the scholars' idea there, but I just went towards the history and said, look, this isn't exactly what you couldn't verify these things the Bible verifies about what's going on in the world if it was all mythography, right? You couldn't. And in fact, if you're going, you know what it is? It's historicalized fiction. There's no example of that except for the Iliad in the ancient world. So again, it would be a very unique piece of literature. So stage 2 would be the archetype move. You can say, well, okay, if it's an archetype, instead of just the genre, the whole Bible's myth, you can say not a lot of scholars don't believe it is. There's a lot of difference between ancient mythology and the Bible. Extraordinary amounts of differences. Third move is, okay, maybe it's just it was in the air at the time. Well, that's hard to verify, right? The idea of verifying something that's in the air is really, really difficult. First, you have to live in 1st century. Maybe you can get what sources are you pulling from for that? And did you know the scholarly consensus about the idea of a theme or archetype of a dying and rising God figure is not the scholarly consensus. They don't think it warrants the title of being so common in the ancient world that you could call it an archetype. And further, even if you're right, I can't verify it. Right? Devil's in the details. Last, somebody says, well, I just think the central figure in the Bible, the most compelling figure in history, Jesus Christ, then you need to ask, who are you comparing him to? Well, it's not just one person. Then give me 4 or 5. Who are you talking about? I had a teaching assistant at Georgia stand up when a buddy of mine was speaking over there and said, Jesus is just Hercules. And I said, help me here. Did Jesus clean out stables by redirecting a river? Did he kill his daughters? He didn't have daughters. What are you talking about? Well, he went up on a pyre, I said, on Mount Oeda, and a lightning bolt came down, and then he disappeared. And I said, I'm not seeing how there's any connection at all. Well, he's a powerful figure that was sort of a divine human person that, sort of died. I went, that's the elephant in Mulvihill with the ears, right? I mean, you got to do more work than that. You can't just say that sort of thing and just write it off QED. Be aware that our society has outrun the scholarship on this and is running far wild than the scholars are doing in this area, that you should feel confident that most scholars don't think the archetype is there. There is not one professional scholar that says, I think that the gospel writers literally lifted stories out of an ancient book, a myth, and put it in the Gospels, and they would be willing to stand behind that. There's also no scholar on the planet that's a professional scholar that will say, I'm standing here behind the idea that Jesus is a direct copy of this figure. They won't do that. Why? Because they know if you check the original source out, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Remember, differences make a difference. As a matter of fact, you don't remember anything else from tonight? How you manage your differences will be crucial to success in life. Whether you keep friends, whether you keep a spouse, right? Whether you do, differences make a difference. And they're far more important than similarities, because how you manage those are going to determine what you do and how well you do. So how you handle failure as well, the difference between your expectation and the result. So again, differences do mean something, and the only way you can make an authentic parallel evaluation is if you have it in front of you. Girls, imagine if there was one guy here at Georgia State that you could date. One. Right? Comparison requires what? Multiple people to compare, to weigh back and forth. You need multiple, you need a lot of things to put into your comparative analysis to make an adequate parallel claim. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. What else? Two fallacies, real quick, to be aware when people make parallel claims, real quick. I know we're talking about fallacies, and you're like, oh my gosh, he's going to do logic, I want to kill myself. A fallacy is simply a common, that means it happens all the time, a common mistake in thought or in speech. Fallacy, from the word fallacious, this sort of thing, fallacy, right? The two most common fallacies that people commit that run with the parallel thesis are listed right here on your page. The first fallacy is called the essentialist fallacy. That's assuming because something's been one way for a while, it will remain that way forever into the future. And this is especially ridiculous when it comes to religions. Religious practice, religious ritual, and religious narrative. Right? That somehow the way they were worshiping in Egypt, if it happens to get adopted by the Greco-Romans, will remain largely the same. No. There's radical differences that are introduced over millennia, okay, for most religious traditions. The second is a little more difficult, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. It's called the fallacy of the undistributed middle, okay? And that means just basically this. When you take two things and compare just the similarities and leave out all the middle difference categories, you're going to make a mistake, right? So, like in Zeitgeist, when it has this, and it's great too, is when you watch that, and I hate going after that movie. It's like charging a windmill, right? It's a hollow victory because no scholars take it seriously, but it is quite popular, right? Millions and millions of views, and people think this, oh yeah. They were showing it at the University of Georgia. During Friday night, the Secular Society, the UG Atheists, were showing it on a big screen in the quad. Zeitgeist! You know, they did this a couple of years ago, and so, but when you see this, it's almost, the tone of the narrator is like, oh, God, these stupid Christians. Like, Jesus looks just like Dionysus and Mithras, born on the 25th of December, crucified, died, was baptized, was considered God, called the Son. Even the narrator's locution, the way his voice is supposed to give you the impression that this is so passé. This is such common knowledge, you should know this, but you're just benighted and hoodwinked, and you've been so by this grand conspiracy called Christianity. But when you look at that, if they put up more accounts of this being, like I told you with Dionysus, right? Dionysus was known as the god that gave the gift of wine to humankind. Well, they go, well, Jesus' first miracle. So they kind of go, wow, so Jesus made water into wine. Dionysus gives wine in order for you to literally leave your reason behind, have orgies, pull animals and humans apart, and cannibalize them. That sounds just like the Jesus guy. But if you include all those extra details, right, the parallel, right, it's gone. You see what I'm saying? But if you just go, hey, when in Cana, first miracle, god of wine. Oh, Dionysus considered to be what? The son of Zeus. His second birth, Dionysus, Nisus was caregiver, Dio two births. But his second birth was from a maiden, right? So that's kind of like, see, you got a birth account. But if you include these details, the thing falls apart. It falls apart every single time. I haven't found one example of something holding up. Not one. And that's hard, right? I mean, 417 pages of looking at this stuff and going, okay, do they meet the 5 criteria I got from these atheistic scholars? Or at least agnostic scholars that don't seem to share our position. When they match ancient literature, did any of these hit it? None of them hit it. None of them. Even the more interesting examples. So I wanted you guys to be aware of this and have a healthy degree of skepticism about this, and just know, if nothing else, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, just remember There are a lot of people that are going much further than the data would warrant with this thing. Much, much further. Even further than what skeptical scholars would say. I read you some of the guys that think we're nuts for being Christians. Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier. Look online, Richard Carrier. If you Google his name, the essays will fly about how Christianity is ridiculous. And Robert Price. And all of them are saying, gosh, there are some really bad myth scholars. Not even scholars. There are really bad myth ideas out there online, especially online. So you have to be really, really, really careful when it comes to this stuff. And just say, hey, look, I'd love to look at your original source if you got it. Can you give me hey, look, we got a nice library here. In fact, we're right near Emory, one of the best in the Southeast. If there's an original source, I can probably find it in its original language there, at least a copy of it. Well, I don't really have it. I mean, I just, hey, it's like, really was worship, and, December 25th, you're like, all right, where is this? Where? He was called, like, Son of God, where? That's great. I love it, and I need to see if it's right. Let's see if it's before, and then let's see if you're right about what you're talking about. And look, that's not an unfair claim, is it? Just say, hey, what's the evidence? That's not bad. And I would encourage them to say, look, just look at the original sources. Don't pick up a textbook that passes off something in a letterbox on the side of the page with no original sources or scholars to back it up, even though it's a textbook and it had a committee that decided what would go in. Don't take the internet that seriously when it comes to these claims. Be sure to look them up. Try to check it out yourself as best you can. We live in an age where you can get some of this electronically, right? All right, well, it's about 5 of 8. I can say more, but I don't want to put you completely to sleep. So, just so you know, this is my brother works in the fire department at Woodstock. I think I can say this. He has a buddy there that's like telling, he talks to his, when you're depending on someone to save your life in a fire situation, you get close to these guys. And this guy said, hey, I'm not a Christian, but I know the Bible. I know the Bible. And my brother said, okay, well, let's have a discussion about it. This a couple weeks ago. And the guy goes, well, good, I've been wanting to talk to you about this. I can kind of tell you're a believer, but I don't want to say anything about it. And he goes, but I'm familiar. Like, I know all the stories. I know stories like Moses and like Theseus and like Medusa and the Kraken. My brother went, he started laughing. The guy's like, not laughing. He's like, no, I really, my brother said, there's no Medusa, Theseus, or the Kraken in the Bible. What are you talking about? Another guy comes up and goes, I saw it in Noah movie. That was, I don't know how do I can't put this gently. It was a complete turning of the story all the way around. I mean, I was expecting them to be, the mythological golems or with the multiple arms. I thought, okay, that's funny. That's just, but Noah becoming a psychopathic killer on the ark, and that's why God saved him, so he could kill everybody, make sure they were all dead, and then commit suicide. Okay. In fact, there's a movie coming out by Ridley Scott, who's a Roman Catholic, the guy who did Gladiator. No connection to the Noah movie, but it's on Moses, and it's Christian Bale. Batman, right? There's going to be Moses and Pharaoh, and it looks awesome. And listen how they're billing it. It's not as bad as Noah. So, I mean, but here's the problem. You have this sort of, and you should have known. With Noah, there was the atheistic director, I think it was Darren Aronofsky, was the one who did it, and it's like, I mean, he was going to just pull the narrative to pieces. But the point is, man, this thing's starting to get sort of mainstream. You know what I'm saying? And it's not really, it's running well past, in fact, the opposite. It's running counter to the scholarship in the area, the people that have actually spent their lives looking at this stuff. I appreciate you guys' time. I know your time is very, very valuable, man. If you're here at this school, I remember, when I go speak at colleges, I'm just amazed anybody shows up at all. So I appreciate your time and attention. I hope I've given you some confidence about this issue and to be confident about it. I'm still looking. I'm on character 22. This will be a book when I'm done with my doctoral thesis. But I'm still looking for a character that matches Jesus in the salient details of death and resurrection. I'm still searching high and low. Any book I can find, anywhere. See you guys. Are there any questions at all about what we've talked about? I've tried to keep it somewhat organized and say, here are the different levels of skeptical sort of push you'll hear and how to work it out and respond. Any questions or comments at all?
I have just a personal question.
Yes. Your name?
April.
April. I'm Joe, so you haven't met yet, but yeah.
So what's your, I guess, whatever research you've done or anything that you've learned in church as far as proof that Jesus does exist, what speaks to you the most, that's most substantial to you as far as proof, just that you've learned that really spoke to you and said, wow, that fact right there,
What a great question. multiple things. And just so you know, this is something that, I was going to say it. I was speaking at a Vineyard church once, April, and this girl came up all distressed after, and I talked about the reason why I think the resurrection happened. That was the topic, right? And this is a very emotive church, nothing wrong with emotions, but the girl came up and said, well, if you're right about all these good reasons to believe in the resurrection, where does faith come in? And I said, well, you've got a non-traditional view of what faith is. Faith is not the sheer willpower to believe something you know isn't true. Like, what couldn't happen, but I said, if that were the case, you'd have the best faith in the world if I give you a bunch of reasons not to believe in the resurrection, you believed it anyway. I said, do you understand? That's not the truth. No, there's not a theologian alive that says that's what faith is. That it's just literally, what did Will Durant say? Believing in what you know ain't true. That's not it. But what a great question. One of the things that, of many things that moves me, is when you look at this character, Jesus, you find the most astounding, if it's fictional, character ever created. There was a skeptic in France named Voltaire, and Voltaire didn't like Christians at the time. He was an agnostic. And Voltaire said, I have to admit this, though. If Jesus isn't real, we should fall to our knees, whoever the authors were, because they created the most compelling fiction in the history of the world. I don't know if you've thought about this. It's driven civilizations. It has launched missionary movements. It is the catalyst for hospitals, orphanages, you name it. It has been the most. It puts Tolkien to shame, right? It puts Lewis. It puts Homer to shame. It's not even close. So he said, I would have to fall on my knees to the authors who have created the most compelling fiction ever. And I think one of the things that speaks to me is when you find skeptics that will admit, I don't believe in everything that you believe about Jesus, but I have to admit this is the most powerful figure ever. I give you like Napoleon saying everything I've ever done, and this guy was, arrogance would be an understatement, right? He's like, take everything I've done, it's not even a scintilla of what Jesus has done. And this is somebody who wasn't exactly a believer either. You take even somebody like Gandhi, who was really close to conversion. C. Stanley Jones was a missionary friend of his that almost converted Gandhi. He said Gandhi was quoted as saying, "Christ I like, Christians I don't," but he was quite a weird guy. But anyway, I've just read a couple biographies on him just in the last 5 years. But anyway, either way, you have a guy that has motivated a lot of people that said Jesus is far more of a motivator. You have Jesus being the catalyst of movements that are absolutely unbelievable. Somebody said, well, there's also lots of bad stuff done in the name of Jesus. Well, yeah, but that's against what he was talking about. Not what, I mean, you can't blame somebody for, like if you gave somebody plans and money to go build a boat and they took that money and took your supplies, threw them all in the river and burned down all the buildings near the dock, they couldn't blame you for defying your plans, right? It seems odd they would defy that. Yes, there have been people that have said, I'm doing something negative in the name of Jesus, but there's far more, first, that's in opposition to what he said you should do, and second, there's far more people that have been impacted positively by Christ than anybody, any character. Take any central character in fiction. You have somebody that's unbelievably compelling, and let me just tell you, he doesn't fit any mold. He doesn't fit any mold. One scholar called him the startling contrast of contrarieties. You have somebody that was very compassionate, but then he blazed with fire towards certain things. He was. You think about even him on the cross. If what he said was true about himself, he could snap his fingers and destroy every Roman and Jew that was against him right there, but he didn't. So you have this sort of marrying of two things that defies any genre description, and you have this central figure that has launched the greatest things thought and done in human history, largely ever. I mean, even the Quran talks about Isa. I don't know if you knew this. God doesn't leave himself without a witness in the second largest religion on the planet. Christians are around 2 billion. Muslims are around 1 billion, right? The Arabic word for Jesus is Isa in there. And Isa was virgin born, could do miracles. Muhammad expressly said, I can't do miracles, and you shouldn't need them. Why? My miracle is that I received something from Gabriel, and I received the revelations. And the Jews would go, well, sorry, if you're saying you're a prophet, you got to do something, predict something. But even Isa is given more props, so much so that Muslims are told never to read the Gospels because it's filled with demons that will manipulate your mind. Because if you read all these positive things about Isa, who's given all sorts of superior power to Muhammad, but then verbally Muhammad said to be a superior prophet. Muhammad's a superior prophet, but Jesus does superior miracles, even in the Quran. And then you move to the Gospels, it's a slam dunk. So they don't let anyone, even their scholars, they pray and say, just if you read this, just protect your mind from floating over towards Isa. So I think when you have historical corroboration in the Bible like that, You have a historic person, a group in the Jews that defy all odds. Everybody else gets either bred out of existence and that doesn't have a homeland that's still in existence today. Covenant group like this, and you have a central figure like Jesus. I think you got a compelling case for giving Jesus a lot of attention. In fact, the best thing you can do with your time is studying more about this person, even if it turns out he's fictional. We don't think he's fictional, but even if he is, to try to mimic an idea that's been so powerful culturally would be awesome, even if it is fictive. But I don't think he's fictive, but I think it's interesting that you have people time after time. I gave a sermon at my church and a couple other churches in the area on how Jesus is unmatched. Unmatched. I mean, and I would tell people this all the time. Look, put him up against Buddha. Put him up against Krishna. Put him up against Joe Smith. Put him up against Muhammad. He will come out better every single time. It doesn't matter who it is. So I find him an extraordinarily compelling figure, so much so that any time I can spend studying him, it's time well spent. Even if it turns out he's not real, which I don't think he is. But if it turns out he's not real, it's still worth my time to investigate an idea that's had this kind of social and world impact. Anybody else? Anything else?
You know what? You might have said this before, but I didn't hear you say anything about your background, how you got started.
Yeah. I had a great job coming out of college, and unfortunately, please take this time seriously. I know you've probably heard these lame adults tell you this, but I had a family that said, look, we've got you a job, but we want you to have a college degree when you get out. So they call it the diploma a piece of paper, right? It's a piece of paper. Consequently, I didn't take my studies seriously. I remember my last semester, I had to take 20 hours almost, and most of that were like I did a racquetball course I never showed up for. And they're like, all right, well, you know what? You didn't show up all semester but one time, so you got to do literally, they made me stay for 12 hours on a racquetball court just if I was going to get the credit. But consequently, I didn't take my studies seriously. Well, when I got the job was a family travel business. We take college-age students, senior citizens, and high school students, domestic, and then once I earned my cred domestic, we go around the world. Well, I started to find out that I had a lot of downtime, flights, bus rides, stuff, and I started meeting people, and I couldn't say anything to them. I had nothing. They'd say something skeptical about Christianity or about their worldview they thought was true, and I'd go to the quiver raised in the church. I'd go to my quiver for an answer, nothing there. Hadn't spent any time, I just took it for granted. I believed in Jesus in my heart, and there's a difference between knowing Christianity is true and showing that it's true. But I didn't have anything that would make evangelism a worthwhile effort. Consequently, I was scared to death of ever talking about Jesus to anyone. And it became double jeopardy when I left the country. Now I'm meeting people all the time that don't necessarily share my view because I've got a broad range, right, of places I'm going. And so I said, well, look, I reasoned in my heart and said, look, and I still believe this, I don't think you can really believe something in your heart that you don't at least to some degree understand in your mind. Ratio Christi, right? I think you have to, at some level, make sense of it. Not completely, it wouldn't be God if that were the case, but you have to make some sense of something here before you can say you believe it here and it's going to drive your actions. So I started thinking, well, if it's true, this whole thing, the biblical thing, Jesus Christ, God, everything, then it's going to be true no matter what investigates it. Truth withstands opposition. So I started reading, and you'd be amazed. I started looking forward, not just slamming anybody, but having these conversations. I used to dread them. And I look forward to it, and we'd have these awesome conversations where I'd see awesome things happen. And it got to a point where I told my wife, who didn't want to hear it at the time, they were grooming me to take over an $8 million a year business. And she said, all right. I said, listen, I'm starting to talk to people on these trips. I've been just doing my own reading. I'm not even, I barely made it through my undergrad program, just kind of screwed around, just got through to get the diploma to get this job. It was waiting for me when I left. Well, what's going on, right? I mean, and my wife said, what's going on? I said, well, I'm witnessing to people. It's pretty cool. In fact, I don't dread what Jesus said in Matthew 28, going to all the world. I now look forward to it. And it's interesting. There have been times where I can't tell you. My wife's name is Jill. I said, I can't tell you, but there are people that said, are they on candid camera? Is there some sort of, is this a joke? Because it sounds like you put this presentation to hit everything I haven't even told you about. And I'm not that bright. And I would just say, well, look, I put this in years ago, and he combined a sermon with a conversation with a friend, with a book I'd read, with a philosopher I'd read. And I couldn't remember all that stuff, and it just would come together, and they'd think it was like some plan or something. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. But what I found was God doesn't zap the information like the Matrix. He could, but he doesn't tend to do that. He tends to cooperate with you. So he'll bring to your remembrance. And that's what the Holy Spirit's supposed to do, bring to your remembrance these things. So my wife would say, shut up. I want you to be the man in this business, and this is where your life's going, and this is going to be money for us. And that all ended. We were on a boat in the Baltic Sea, and it was one of those cruise ships. And in the travel business, when you're guiding a group onto a cruise ship, it's easy because they do all the work, right? You just go and eat dinner and make sure they get on and get off. And it's the easiest money you'll ever make. You're like, all right, good to see you guys. The captain will have all your questions from now on. So we sat across from a couple that the husband was quite skeptical of Christianity. And I wasn't going to get in any fight. I mean, I'm on it's a business trip or whatever. So he starts railing me. My wife's on the trip with me. And so we're out the next day. She's like, why didn't you say anything to that guy? He's like, look, he's his position. I'm not out to be the Bible defender man or anything like that. I said, but she goes, well, you've been telling me stuff on trips or whatever. I said, well, I didn't think you wanted that. You don't like conflict. And, men are 22 times more likely to start conflict than a woman. So I said, so the next night he starts in, and I thought, I'm just going to let him. Well, then he gets to the point where he's like, I just can't see how anybody could believe in X Christianity and still remain rational or have a mind worth speaking of it all. And that's where I just had it. And I said, all right, now what are you talking about? We started talking. That conversation moved to a 3-hour conversation in the pool bar. And not in the pool bar. It was actually somebody playing pool with playing the piano in a bar upstairs on the ship. And when we left that conversation, my wife said, that's unbelievable. I mean, that guy must have stopped a number of times and who told you that I thought about that? And I said, I'm telling you. And she's like, and basically just had a really horrible night and got up the next morning and said, you've got to quit the family business. You got to go try to teach people how to do this. That was unbelievable. So once my wife was on board, you're not going to just move your life trajectory like this, especially in a possibly really lucrative career that you're being groomed for, unless your spouse is on board. And so the rest is history. I started inquiring around, started praying. I get a call from somebody who says, hey, listen, if you'll be an RD, resident director of an apartment, we'll pay for your grad studies. I'm like, okay. So I go do that, and then a little bit later, I get into contact with find a guy I'd read almost everything he'd ever done, Bill Craig, and find out he's in Atlanta here, William Lane Craig, and I'm like, I actually went to find him on a dare. Just tell him this is too much if you just want me to stop. I started work at this academy I work at, and I had this picture of Bill Craig. I read all his work. I was like a big fan, not a stalker, but pretty. And so, yeah.
William Lane Craig.
Yes.
He's the guy who does debates.
He does. He is probably considered easily one of the top 3 Christian intellectuals on the planet. He is, I think he's done 56 debates. He's tied 2 and won the rest against PhD holding atheists. He's beastly. And he is an incredible man. Usually the people that academic, they're really kind of pretentious there. And he is. Anyway, I'm at my school. I'm doing the parent meet and greet. And one of the parents goes, hey, I think that guy teaches at my Bible study. And I said, sir, what's your son's name? He goes, Andrew Thompson. I said, can I say that? Anyway, he goes, no, I know. I said, look, your son's going to be fine in here. You don't have to try to make a connection with me. He goes, I think that guy's my Bible study. Your son's going to do fine in here. He's like, no. He actually teaches at my church. And I went, no, he doesn't. I know for a fact. Bill Craig is still over in Europe, Belgium maybe. And that's where he's doing his second page adjustment. He's like, no, that guy teaches at my church. And I said, your son's going to do fine in here. Quit trying to make this connection. I was awful. He goes, I'll bet you $20. You come out of the church at 11 o'clock. You come out and see. So I come out and sure enough, there he is teaching. I'm like, what in the world? So I listen to him teach, and I go up to him after. Of course, I insult him because this is how I am. I do it on accident. But I said, you're a lot more personable in person than you are like in your books or in your debates. In your debates, you're like a logic-chopping Terminator, but you're actually a pretty personable guy. He goes, thanks. Was that an insult or a compliment? And I said, no, it was a compliment or whatever. I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, we moved to Atlanta because of the airport, and we wanted to be a part of a large Christian community, and where we could impact a lot of people, and I could get to an international airport where I go because he travels everywhere. And so I said, well, listen, here's what I'm all about. And we started talking. We developed a friendship, and then I became, a research assistant to him, and then that opened new doors. And a guy he was mentoring named Mike Lacona said, listen, I've got a guy that'd be great if you want to do a doctorate. If you were doing a doctorate, we could take you with us, do these sort of things. So you already speak in these venues. We take you to the big venues. And I said, well, okay, I've got a job and kids or whatever. And they're like, okay, well, then they call up. So what would you like to do for doctoral program? And I said, well, I can't afford one right now. I'd get a loan or something. And they said, well, what's your thesis idea? And I said, well, it's kind of the idea of the Gospels and mythology. And they said, we've been looking for somebody to do that. And I'm like, doctorate, right? Well, look, we got a lot of scholarships. I was like, I don't know, all this stuff just kind of, so it's really been cool. Sorry for such a long explanation, but all I can say is, man, when you start feeling those tugs from the Lord, the Holy Spirit, run them down. It's been a ride, man. Now, it hasn't been all easy, but it's been a ride, and there's not many people that get immediate feedback on their ministry, right? There's people that go in the mission field and they don't ever see the fruits of their labors in their own lifetime, right? But God's been gracious enough to give back a lot of feedback to me before I'm dead that has been really, really encouraging, extraordinarily encouraging. So maybe that'll answer why I'm passionate, or at least why I'm trying to be passionate about some things. If I can get where I'm going downtown Atlanta. Anybody else got any questions? Love to talk with you.
One more,
Yeah,
if
go for
that's
it.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like I don't know how to word it.
Okay.
Okay, so one thing like that you kept saying, the devil's in the details.
Yeah, sorry for
So-
the pun. I mean, I could have used a better euphemism.
I get it.
You get it.
I
Okay.
get it.
Right.
And that's how I'm kind of using it to gauge my question.
Gotcha.
But when there's details that's actually factual,
Yes.
how do you, and I guess this could be personal too, like how do you per se go about I don't necessarily want to say convince because everybody's not convincible.
That's okay, but you know what? Be persuasive. There's nothing wrong. Everybody needs to be good at persuasion, especially in a free democratic society. So yeah.
And how do you use that? How do you use that information to kind
Yes.
of help people?
Here's how. For me, and it's not my idea, it's Jesus's. You ask questions.
Mhm.
Here's the cool part about asking questions. First, Jesus did it, right? Good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? Why do you call me good? Pilate, are you the king of Jews? Did somebody tell you this, or did you come to it on your own? You know this about me on your own, or did somebody tell you to ask me about this? Jesus answered questions with questions all the time, and the reason why is just the same reason, I think, one of the same reasons why Socrates, the ancient philosopher prior to Jesus, did too. It helps people open up within their own assumptions. People don't like being thought of as a project, or that you're beating them over the head with logic. Nobody likes that. I mean, I can convince you that there are people that will find clear truths they wish would suspend in order to prevent them from being embarrassed. In other words, there's no sense cutting off someone's nose and giving them a rose to smell. There's no litany in Proverbs that says, don't beat somebody in the head with logic and go, now Jesus loves you. See, now you look like an idiot because you thought this other stuff. You ask questions. Jesus did. It makes people justify what they've said. It forces you to listen, and that's a huge, huge part of being an ambassador for Christ, being able to listen. And last, you get to decide when the conversation ends or begins. I mean, you're asking the questions, you're running the show, so you don't use it like, listen, you idiot. You say, well, what makes you think that's true? Or where are you getting that from? Or why do you think that's true? I actually don't agree with that, but I don't want to be mean or insult you, but why would you say something like that? Even if they don't start with a skeptical comment, you can say, like things I've found have helped, like, what do you think's wrong with the world? Almost everybody has a deep intuition something's wrong. Things aren't going right. Things aren't getting better. Well, what do you think makes sense of that? Ask that question. Why do you do what you do? Why do you, if you believe X or Y, why did you, to ask those sort of things are great because you get to listen and see where they're coming from, and you get to discern what ideas are driving those comments. And that, in that sense, then you can really get a feel for what's going on. And you don't just keep doing questions and it looks like you're dodging, right? But even when I'm in a skeptical interaction with somebody, I never allow them to literally meet me at the big bullseye. You know, I do this in the college setting. You can't just, in a personal conversation, you can't just be the bullseye where they just sit back and throw darts at you until you mess up. You have to say, okay, you get to ask questions, then I get to ask something, right? And some things are really helpful. One of the things that I've found that helps me discern where somebody's at is ask them, if we were to lock, this isn't my idea, but if we were to lock ourselves in a room and answer all your skeptical questions, just say hypothetically, I'm not saying I can't, but let's say I could. Would you convert? I've never had somebody say they would. You know why? Because at the end of the day, it's really a will issue. I want to live the way I want to do what I want, I don't want God looking over my shoulder. And then what happens is they kind of cloak that in intellect. They cloak that in intellect. And you find people admit this on the back end. One of the greatest logicians of the 20th century was a guy named Mortimer Adler. He said, I started realizing that what I taught logic didn't make a lot of sense. Because he was an atheist, didn't believe in the supernatural or an abstract realm. He didn't believe in anything but matter, right? Configurations of matter, it's spatially extended with weight. He said, but I'm teaching logic, which is itself not material. It's like, ugh. So he said, in my late 30s, I started to realize, I got a big problem. My atheism doesn't make sense of what I'm teaching. Logic and at least the abs of materialism, naturalism, don't go together. He said, but I realized at 37 years old that if I did this, I was the type of person that would have to go in on both feet, or else I'd feel guilty the rest of my life. So he said, I resisted looking into any higher power idea. And then around 77, he goes, I've got to look into this stuff. And it wasn't just because he was afraid of dying. He said, no, here it is. It looks like that. And he becomes a believer at 78 years old. But he said, look, I understood very clearly what this meant for my lifestyle. I understood this. And you notice this is Romans 1. That which can be known about God is clearly seen, being understood through what's been made, so that men and women are without excuse. You suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Suppress means you have it, you push it down. I can't tell you the scores of friends that have avoided things. I've got a buddy of mine that worked at the University of San Diego that went to a conference, used to have the school pay for me to go to a conference with other biologists. He went up to San Francisco to this conference, 1,500 other biologists, and the guy asked the head of the meeting, he just goes, look, can I just see a show of hands who believes in a higher power? Don't tell me what type, just theism. Most everybody in the auditorium raised their hand, and this guy started to get apoplectic. He's like, he went out in the hall, and here's why. He'd been raised since he was small by his parents to say, Christians are inherently stupid. That's why they believe the foolishness of Christianity. They're dumb. Anybody that believes in a higher power is either academically uninformed, psychologically impaired, or just a crazy person. Here are people that are easily his equal and his superiors all going, we believe in a higher power. And so what's his answer? He doesn't go back to any more conferences. Isn't that interesting? So I'm not going to chase that down. I'm just not going to deal with it anymore. That's Romans 1. How about, I'll go by even one of the more famous atheists, right, was Charles Darwin. I hate people using the deathbed analogy with Charles Darwin. There's not, even if he did pronounce it on his deathbed, he could have just been being afraid. You still have to deal with this as an origin story for secularism. The second thing is it's just based on really weak accounts, his deathbed confession. But a year before he died, 1885, he died in 1886, he had one of his best friends put in his best friend, the Duke of Argyll, in his diary. He said, I had a talk with my friend Charles about this. He was at this point studying orchids and earthworms. And I said to him very clearly, this was the Duke of Argyll, said, this is really well read. I mean, the evidence for this conversation is very, very strong. And he says, Charles, isn't it impossible to look at even earthworms and orchids and not be immediately confronted with the idea that a mind put this sort of complexity together? And Darwin said, that notion overwhelms me most of the time. But if I wait it out and distract myself and stop looking at those things, it'll pass. That is Romans 1. That's Romans 1. And that's why questions, I think, are important. Because if you're asking questions, then you're getting people to open up within their own assumptions. If Romans 1's right, you're going to eventually get to the idea that there's some nascent God idea, general revelation in there that they're suppressing, that they understand. Because God says there's no excuse in Judgment Day. When the famous quote by Bertrand Russell, he said, when he's debating Frederick Copleston, Bertrand Russell, famous 20th century atheist, he goes, Copleston said, what if you're wrong? You're old, Bertie. That's what they call Bertrand Russell. You're old. What if when you die, you meet God? He goes, very simple. I'll say not enough evidence. Romans 1 says you're not going to be able to say that. God will say, no, you had evidence, you suppressed it. You can't say not enough evidence. You can say you resisted the evidence. You can't say you suppressed it. And I think questions get people to that point. When I used to teach at the college level as a teaching assistant, there would be people that would really, really want to party on a Friday night. And then all of a sudden, Monday, they had all these intellectual questions about Christianity. I'm like, what is going on here, right? You saw I just want to party this weekend. I'm hungover. I don't even know the Bible's true. Where did this come from? Oh, right. You made a decision first, and now the intellect part's coming second. There are some honest skeptics out there that really have an issue with some of the data, but I find a lot of people, it's more of maybe they've been hurt by the church group, maybe they've had a major, major, major problem in their lives, and they have the emotional problem of evil or pain.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think my question was more so geared to people who do take those nitpick problems that they have with different, and which, disclaimer, I'm not big on studying Christianity, so I could be wrong when I say this, but let's say like a feminist group who have a problem with Christianity because of different things about women against the Bible, like being stoned, if they committed adultery, or just different.
Males too, don't forget. Yeah, I hear you. Just that kind of, or the fact that, Eve's the catalyst for the fall and that sort of thing.
Right,
yeah.
and they take that and they disattach themselves from Christianity for those reasons, so
here's you go. So ask questions like this. Let's use that as an example and say, well, what do you think about women were the first founders of Jesus as a resurrected person, were found by women recorded in the Bible? That's kind of interesting. How about the fact that Mary is esteemed above all women? There are a lot of women esteemed in the Bible too. In fact, the modern suffragists, not feminists, the suffragist movement for voting rights, equal pay, that sort of thing, not the modern version, which is radically different than the suffragists, use biblical passages to support their want and their drive for rights. So you say, just ask more questions. Say, have you really given the Bible a good look like this? Yes. You can, as a matter of fact, you can say, well, Eve was deceived, but Adam didn't even have a supernatural deceiver. He just followed Eve's lead. So even in that sense, even if Eve being the catalyst for the fall, according to the Genesis account, however you take that, then you still have the woman coming out a little better than the male there. So it's not a slam dunk against females. Like I had a girl at a university once say that very thing to me. Like the minute I got to Genesis 3, I just stopped reading because that's against the whole birth pains thing and this sort of thing. And I said, well, keep reading. I mean, there are a number of examples where women, Jesus wasn't supposed to speak to, rabbis weren't supposed to speak to women. He had women disciples, not the inner 12, but he had women disciples. Paul let women speak into his life. Keep reading, right? You see what I'm saying? You just ask questions. Well, how are you getting there? Have you read this, right? If you've read this and you gave up on it, well, did you read this? Because I find this encouraging about women in the Bible. Or I find this encouraging about male and female relations in the Bible. This is good stuff. Again,
well, like you said, some of the things you said, to kind of be perception of how you dissect it.
Yeah. You know what I mean? And just say, well, look, it's women are given big props in this book, far more so than the other holy or the other religious traditions we're talking about. I mean, even you take something as accepting and open that the ethics they claim as Buddhism, right? Even in that scenario, you have a situation where, Siddhartha had to be convinced. Now think about that. The enlightened one that had more wisdom than anybody has ever lived had to be convinced by his disciples to let women become followers, right? And then when he did that, he added 100 extra rules for women followers because he didn't really want them. See, you don't have that kind of thing going on in Christianity. Yes, you have some women behaving badly like Jezebel, but you have just as many women like Deborah that are remarkable women of faith in the Bible. So that's the way I kind of go with that one, right? But ask questions. That's the thing. Ask questions and just get them to probe a little bit more and say, okay, it's not all bad, right? I mean, there's only anything that's just all bad all the way through. Any other questions or comments?